So good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is James Sterling. I'm the Provost here at Imperial College, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome you all to tonight's event, a special lecture organised by the Grantham Institute for Climate Change and the Environment. And a particularly warm welcome to those of you visiting us here at Imperial for the first time, and also a particularly warm welcome to our speaker this evening, John Knight, Executive Vice President of Statoil, and his colleagues who are here with them this evening. Our recently published college strategy commits us to use the fantastic foundational disciplines that we have here at Imperial, and our appetite and enthusiasm for multidisciplinary research working across disciplines to address the most pressing global challenges, and arguably the most pressing global challenge facing us today is climate change. And it's great that our Grantham Institute is right in the vanguard of the debate on climate change, providing the hard scientific and engineering evidence is absolutely essential to underpin any debate on climate change. The Grantham Institute, as you probably know, has been extraordinarily active over recent months with numerous lectures and workshops, forums and events, all leading up to the United Nations Climate Change Conference in Paris in December. And this event tonight is one of the series of special lectures that the Institute has organised. Now, Imperial works very closely, of course, with the oil and gas sector, and indeed Statoil are very valuable partners in that, not just as research collaborators, but also as a company that employs many of our graduates. And I think sometimes one gets the impression from the media that the oil and gas industry have their heads completely in the sand when it comes to climate change and sustainability. In fact, the company that John represents, Statoil, are renowned as being one of the leaders in the oil and gas sector in terms of sustainability right at the heart of their global strategy and their business development. That's why it's great to have John and his team here this evening. John will tell us about his personal commitment in dealing with climate change and how he and Statoil are facing the long-term challenges. So it's great to have them here. I'm very grateful for the time that they've given to be with us this evening. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague, Professor Martin Siegert, one of the co-directors of the Grantham Institute, who will introduce the lecture and our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, James. And just to add my words of welcome on the Provost, nice to see you all this evening, and you're all very welcome here at Imperial College, and looking forward to what is going to be a very interesting lecture by John Knight. Just to tell you what will be happening, John will speak for about 45 minutes or so, and then we'll take a questions and answers with John and his colleagues, Margaret Mistry, who's Head of Sustainability Communication, and also Charlotte Wolfby, who's the Vice President for Sustainability Strategy at Statoil, and they'll be here, and they'll be able to answer some questions for you. A few words before we start. John Knight is an Executive Vice President of Statoil. Statoil, for those who don't know, is the largest importer of gas to the UK and the second largest supplier to Europe. It's also one of the largest offshore wind operators. It's a Fortune 50 oil and gas company, which is majority owned by the Norwegian state and quoted on both the New York and the Oslo stock exchanges. John is a member of the Executive Committee of Statoil, where he runs the Global Strategy and Business Development Department and the Country Manager for Statoil in the UK. In the lead up to all this work, he worked in managing Statoil's international division, growing the business around the world. I should also say that John is, as you'll hear, a strong supporter of action on climate change and has very kindly agreed to serve on our advisory board for the new master's programme that the Grantham Institute just jointly with the business school here called Climate Change Management and Finance, which we launched last week. So thank you very much for serving on that. Previously, John studied law at Emmanuel College in Cambridge and Inns of Court School of Law. He practiced law for 6 years, including at Shell, and held various positions in energy investment banking, including the head of energy at Chase, UBS, and Sullivan Brothers, before joining Statoil in 2002. Now, a quick glance at your Twitter account, John, shows that aside from sustainability in gas and oil, which we're here to talk about, John is also a passionate supporter of rugby. We probably won't say too much about that this evening, if you don't mind. But we're looking forward also to hearing maybe a little bit about your lovely, beautiful black Labrador puppy, Monty K. Looking forward to hearing that. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming John Knight.
Thank you, Martin. I didn't know you were going to mention Monty. There we are. So, good evening, everybody. About 3 years ago, a number of us at Statoil sat down and thought about the business challenges that we had. And we asked the question whether the next couple of decades would look anything like the last couple of decades, and whether our business governance, our leadership, and our business processes were really fit for the future. And we concluded that in 3 areas we were not fit for the future. We need to make some quite significant changes. The first and most pressing area as an oil and gas company was in the question of capital efficiency and competitiveness of that business. The oil industry was in a lot of trouble with regard to its profitability long before the oil price collapsed. It's not the subject of this evening, but that's something that we debated some years ago. And then we took the view that the progress of politics, geopolitics, societal involvement, transparency, governance, those sort of issues would only increase in the coming decades, and we felt that in that area of engagement with society we need to do something different. And then in the area of climate change and the transition to a low carbon world, we also felt that whilst our company had achieved a lot within the areas within its control, that there would be increasing pressures on the traditional business and increasing business opportunities within renewables. So we made a lot of changes at that time, but one of them was to gather together all these areas of sustainability, which were scattered mostly in half a dozen different places in the company, mostly in staff areas, not rooted in the core commercial business areas. And we decided to bring them all together, put them under single management, and integrate them into the central corporate commercial core in our strategy division, and what we call our business development division, which is essentially undertaking the actions and negotiations to structure the business portfolio. And so I've been responsible for that area and that integration since the beginning of 2013. And there are five big things which have happened since then, which lead me to be here at the Institute today. The first thing was we decided that on a continuous basis we needed to debate questions of sustainability, broad writ, but especially climate, at the board's monthly meetings. So from the beginning at the spring of 2013 to the spring of 2014, we went through something that we called our sustainability reset every month, debating what our current policy was, where we felt we should step up.
We didn't actually announce that. It's maybe the first time it's been discussed in public, but it was a big internal move. About the same time, we took the view that it wasn't just the non-executive and executive board that needed to be more engaged with these issues, but also the senior leadership, what we call the L2, L3, L4, the sort of the second and tertiary leadership of the company, needed to be more future fit in its mindset and its understanding. So we started, again, this hasn't been discussed publicly, but it was very significant for us internally. We started a program a bit like the Imperial MSc. We called it for really trying to get our key leaders more fluent on these questions. We called it Taking Statoil Beyond 2025, TSB 25. And half of it was about the oil and gas capital challenges, and half of it was essentially about the carbon and climate challenges. This year, we changed the governance of our executive directors, executive committee. We brought in 4 new people. All 4 of them were alumni of TSB 25. So it's with great pleasure that I sit on your advisory board, and I'm very interested to take part in that and pass on any experiences we've had with our sort of internal version of it. The third thing we did, about this time last year, our then chief executive decided to work somewhere else, and we had a period of sort of interregnum. But it didn't lead to a stasis in the management of the company, particularly around climate, because when he had left, the board said to those of us that chose to remain that they felt that although we'd had the sustainability reset, they wanted us to be even more forward-leaning on this issue and not to wait for a new chief executive. So we started another, multinationals work in acronyms. We started another program which we called TLC, to Transition to the Low Carbon Economy. And we took people who were working at the second and third echelon in the operating core out of their day jobs. They still kept those day jobs, but they had night jobs too, to discuss under the leadership of my area what step changes were feasible and needed. And it was that TLC program which led to our new chief executive earlier this year announcing that we were going to create a new business division on a par with our traditional oil and gas business divisions, an operating division which we called New Energy Solutions. And this is something that I'll give you a bit more description of it later, but it's at the forefront of our the serious attempt to transition to a low carbon world. One other thing that happened is that all of us from the board, the executive, these different layers of management started to spend more time outside the oil and gas industry. Learning from other industries, learning from academics, learning from critics. And one of those people that I spent some time with was Professor Jürgen Randers from Oslo University, one of the early pioneers of thought about the limits to growth. And I've taken particular interest in discussing these things with him. He's a great critic of the industry, but he's also a great thinker. We also have on our strategic advisory board Professor Joe Stiglitz from Columbia, who, of course, he's got 2 Nobel Prizes, one of them for his work in the IPCC. So a lot of the people that I've spoken of, and many of those who are now on our executive directors, have spent time being challenged by Joe. We also have on our advisory committee Peter Ho, who was head of the civil service in Singapore, one of the architects of the modern Singapore, a sort of protege of Lee Kuan Yew, very profound thinker. And he is the person who introduced me to the concept of the black elephant. I'm going to mention black elephants throughout this lecture, which is a mixture of the black swan and the elephant in the room. It's the things that we're all kind of aware of, but don't quite take account of as we make our arguments or go about our business. And I'm going to use the lecture to point out some of the black swans that I think there are in the climate debate. So I'll try to get the lecture split into sort of 4 themes. The first will be to say a bit about my own personal views of this. Of course, a large part of my person is my job and being at Statoil, but of course it's not my primary thought when I wake up. So I want to start with what my personal framework for talking about this subject is. Then I'll move on to talk about the philosophy, the formal philosophy and framing that we at Statoil have on this subject. I'll spend some time, but not too much time, on what we've actually done, not because we haven't done a lot, actually. Talking to a colleague in the front here saying, I saw all your CEOs in Paris and they talk about what they think they ought to do, but not about what they've done. I will say what we have done, but I don't want to turn it into an advert, because I want to get on to the end of the lecture where I want to speculate on what I think the challenges will be for modern oil and gas companies over the next couple of decades, and where I think we will all have to go. So I want to end on a forward-looking note. So firstly, here's my own framing about this issue. So like my company, I take for granted that the climate science about 2 degrees and the track of business as usual, this is a cartoon taken from one of the business as usual scenarios, is the case. I don't presume to spend any time fundamentally questioning that science. And I look at it over quite a long period, because I look at it from the point of view of the people I know best, which is my own family. So what you've got at the bottom there is the bottom blue line is a timeline for my parents' generation, and I've also plotted on there the Jürgen Rander's works from '72 and his latest book, which is a speculation of what 2052 holds for us all. And really, I think my father's generation, my parents my mother's passed away and my father's about to. They were born in the 20s. And throughout that period, this was not really an imminent challenge or known about or researched. And by the time we were all familiar with these issues, people from that generation were largely retired. So the ability of my father's generation, I think, to have addressed these issues has been relatively limited. Then the top light blue line is, I've got 4 children. That's what I think is the lifeline of my youngest son, George, who was born in 2000. So people of George's age, actually, if we have a business as usual scenario, are the ones who are going to inherit the unacceptable damage to the biosphere and to human societies. And of course, they're so young, although they're much more conscious of these issues than my generation was, they're not in a position to do anything about it. So the way I look at it is that it's actually my generation of people in whatever walk of life, but particularly executives who work in oil and gas companies. We are, there's an urgency of the now, particularly given that sometime in the 2030s, 2040s, some of us will still be at work, or if we're fortunate, alive from my generation. That's the period of lock-in. And so it's now that we have to get this right. So I feel a particular sense of responsibility falls on our generation, for those of you who are also over 50. And I also think about it from a professional point of view, about where my company Statoil is. Statoil was born and created by the Norwegian Labour Party and Labour government in 1972 to develop oil and gas alone and solely in Norway, and it was 100% state-owned. But as that area of oil and gas started to mature, as we started to have some visibility of the flattening out of the productivity of the Norwegian shelf sometime in the 1990s, my predecessor strategist started to think about what would be a transition to a more international footprint, and also a change of culture to more access to private equity and to a more competitive and different type of culture. So the big step change there, which was just about the time I arrived in the company, was to the Norwegian government privatised part of the share capital, and as Martin said, was quoted on the New York and London stock exchanges. We didn't stop being a big Norwegian and partially state-owned company, so it wasn't an event, it was a transition. We're still going through it. And I see the transition to the low-carbon world, both for the oil and gas part of the business and also for new parts of the business that we're just starting to build now, as a similar transition. I make the point because sometimes when I look at some of the debates in public, and when I listen to some policymakers, as I did this weekend, I was with someone from the British Cabinet Office, very capable person, but this person was asking me questions about what are you going to do when there's no more use for oil and gas in 15 years' time? I think it's the wrong framing, it's the wrong question. These things move in transition, they are not sudden events. I was disturbed to be asked that question because I don't think it shows an understanding of the dynamic. So there's a real urgency of the now, which I've illustrated here, and in particular, the debate in public is now moving on to net zero emission societies, looking at 2030 and 2050, and this will be even more the case when the Paris conference is over and the INDCs start to pass into legislation, if that's what happens. It's unfortunately quite a big if. So so when you hear me speak, this is my personal framework for it. It's nothing to do with Statoil, essentially. So now come to some formal issues of how we frame these issues in Statoil. I first want to make clear what Statoil is and what it is not. So it's a largely state-owned oil company, but it's run on commercial lines. The Norwegian state doesn't dictate to us our policy. The board and the management determine policy on the basis of commercial competition. What you see from the chart on your left is that in terms of productive capacity on a daily basis of hydrocarbons, we're about the same size as Total of France, about 2/3 the size of Shell. If you look at the employee numbers there, you'll see that Shell and Total are infinitely bigger. The reason for that is they're not only producers of hydrocarbons, they're also users. And they have enormous, much bigger than us, refineries and petrochemical plants and bigger transport systems and much bigger consumers as well as producers. So we're much more at the wholesale end, and I'll come back to why I make that point later. You'll also see that actually the IOCs, which are the focus of so much attention, particularly in the British press, the three of us added up together don't come anywhere close to competing with Saudi Arabia. So the NOCs are about 90% of this sector. And I think it's a bit of a black elephant. Some of the debates I see focus sort of laser-like on private capital divestment from the IOCs, but it's just part of a much larger system, and let's not lose sight of it. We can debate the relevance of that comment if you like. The other thing to bear in mind is although we have internationalized a lot the last 15 years, our operating capacity, our direct control over the greenhouse gas content of our own productive activities remains very Norwegian. It's more than 80% Norwegian. So although we're an international company these days, our operating footprint is still very Norwegian, and so it's what happens in Norway which moves the needle for the whole of our performance at this point. That will change as we mature our international operating portfolio, but that's the case at the moment. Now I'll just say a few words about our corporate view of the science, of what we take as some of the basic facts from which to start debate and argument and opinion forming. What are our beliefs and expectations rather than our forecasts, and then I'll get to our forecasts and models, which are the subject of so much attention, including from the Carbon Tracker, interesting Carbon Tracker report yesterday. My company has always, for a long time now, had an unequivocal acceptance of the IPCC science. I sometimes see people say, well, the oil industry as a whole funds disputation of that. That's not us. That's not our position. It's not the position of anybody in management. And we unequivocally recognise the contribution to the problem that energy CO2 emission causes, which is illustrated by the black inner circle there. About 65% is energy-related CO2. But to the theme of what I want to say today, you fix that, you haven't fixed the problem. There's a lot of other issues around forestry and agriculture, a lot around consumption as much as production. And when we debate these things, let's be sure that all of us involved in this are addressing the breadth of the problem and not sort of oversimplifying solutions for one part of it. So, just a couple of facts before I get on to beliefs and forecasts. It's an uncomfortable fact for all of us, and especially for climate activists, and I think a black elephant for politicians, including the German politicians who've led the Energiewende in Germany, that actually after all this activity, CO2 and greenhouse gas emission is rising quite significantly. And Statoil, like me personally, accepts that we're about to go into a really critical period where if the issue is not addressed, then we're locking in more than 2-degree warming. And then you see, we publish a sustainability report with a lot of data transparency in it. And you'll pick up from that in terms of our own contributions to Scope 1 CO2 emissions, it's about 16 million tonnes per annum, about 40,000 of methane. And then it's not emissions that come from our operations, but emissions that come from the consumption of our products is just under 300 million tonnes. So let me say something a little less numerical, a little more about what our expectations and forecasts and beliefs are that frame the actions that we've taken. So I read in the Twitter sphere that companies are addicted to business as usual. Well, that's not actually our expectation. Our expectation is that the next couple of decades will see significantly higher carbon costs, actually, that we'll see stricter climate environmental regulation. And we see a buoyant business opportunity in renewable energy. We've already invested several $1 billion in that in offshore wind. And we call for carbon pricing. We've most recently there's been the famous letter of my CEO and other European CEOs published in the Financial Times calling for carbon pricing. People say critics say you call for that because you don't think it'll ever happen. Well, it certainly happened in Norway. The carbon price is about $65 a tonne for the offshore Norway. It does happen. We have the European emissions trading system. It doesn't work very well. I think we'd be in a much better position in Europe if it did work. And we have a lot of advocacy principles. You can read about them in our sustainability report, but the emitter pays is one of those principles. When it comes to our forecasting, I'll go into this in a bit more detail and show you some numbers in a minute. But at the heart of our expectations, as opposed to business as usual, we actually think there'll be a big coal to gas shift. And I'll show you why we think that in a minute. And we think that there will be a significant step change in the growth in renewables, particularly in power generation. And but we also believe, based on our own modelling, authentic modelling, something similar to the IEA. That there's still, even in 2-degree scenarios, there's still going to be quite a lot of oil and gas in the mix. To my initial theme, this is a transition issue. This isn't an extinction event, in our opinion. I don't think that's defensiveness or wish fulfillment. That is actually what we think. Sometimes I read on my Twitter feed that oil companies hide behind the IEA scenarios. Well, let's just remember what the IEA is. It's an organisation that was created to protect the interests of consumers. It's not exactly a oil company front, in my opinion. And then I want to mention some beliefs, which is very important when we start to talk about forecasts. In my opening remarks, I talked about not believing the next 2 decades would look like anything like the last 2 decades. When we look at the business environment, we see extraordinary. The world's always been rather volatile, but we see extraordinary volatility in many macro systems. I'll show you some pictures of that in a minute. And we don't actually run the company on the basis of a most likely case that we are rigidly attached to and everything is optimized around that. That's not how you run a modern, large, multinational company, certainly not an oil and gas company. We have actually quite wide envelopes of outcome, and what we're trying to do is create a business entity that is sustainable within those wide outcomes. I can answer questions on that later if you like. But the reason I mention it is I believe that commentators and, more importantly, politicians and policymakers who, for whatever reason, overinvest in single or linear views of outcomes. For example, Minister Hune went on endlessly, and some people in the Blair government went on endlessly about gas price inevitably rising and getting higher and higher, and designing a renewables capacity around that and a whole logic flow. Well, that's not what's happened, and that's not the world that I live in. The world I live in is like this. On your left is a set of 4 different types of oil and gas hydrocarbon in different types of the world for the last quarter decade. You've got swings over that short period of up to 600%, and gas far from predictions of sort of rising inexorably has actually fallen off a cliff due to technological change, not actually due to climate issues, although as some degree that's the unintended outcome of the energy vendor. We live in a tremendously volatile world. Most geopolitical thinkers and planners have this view. It's called VUCA, for those of you not familiar with it: volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And it's the reason why my Twitter feed is called Mega VUCA, because my experience is it's a mega VUCA world, and it's a question of resilience to wide outcomes rather than precision of forecasting. And on your right there, in a mega VUCA world, you're subject to sudden black swan events that take off both on the supply and demand side. I've given some examples there and given one very popular one in the climate debate, the solar takeoff. But there's more than one black swan that you deal with, and they all, getting the timing of them and the angle of development, small percentage swings in the angle of development can change the whole system. And I'll give you some examples of that in a minute. So this is the world we live in. This is our frame, and it's not about precision. And I whenever I meet a policymaker, I ask them not to overinvest in absolute certainty about these lines. You've actually got to build a degree of resilience and redundancy into your system. A degree of resilience and redundancy that's not present in the British electricity grid at the moment. Now, there's an increasing request from society generally for more transparency of information about multinationals, very understandable given a lot of different events, not least Volkswagen. You have to understand that for commercial entities in a competitive environment, disclosing everything about what you actually think in your valuation handbooks and your economic planning assumptions is a commercial non-starter. That's not how markets work. It's not possible for us to be overly precise about that. Again, that's not defensivism. That's the commercial reality of responsibilities to private shareholders and to your commercial position. However, what we have been doing lately is providing a set of detailed macro models around fuel mixes, which we call our energy perspectives. And we create scenarios like many companies do. And we've created 3 what-if scenarios asking, if you want a certain outcome, what sort of things do you have to do to things like energy intensity and fuel mix and GDP growth and other items like that. They're freely available. They're very interesting thought pieces from which to have a debate. And actually, in 2 of our 3 scenarios, which encompass the envelopes that we work in for our own framing, 2 of those scenarios actually see not business as usual, but actually unprecedented growth of renewables and step changes in energy intensity. I've set out, these slides will be publicly available. I've just set out a summary of what the different scenarios are, but just very basically, let's concentrate on the reform and the renewable scenario. The reform scenario is basically much faster penetration of renewables and much higher degrees of improvement in energy intensity and GDP than we've seen in the last quarter of a century from Kyoto. But not enough to keep within 2 degrees. If you add up the IEA's calculations yesterday about what the Paris INDCs comes to, it might look a bit like this because it's predicating about 2.7 degrees warming. And then we have a renewal forecast, which is, or scenario, which is essentially what does it take in order to get to a 2 degrees stability scenario by 2040. And it's I want to now dwell on 2 numerical aspects of this, and then I'll speed up the rest of it and get to some other aspects. Essentially, if you look to the far left, that's the CO2, not the greenhouse gas, but the CO2 position in 2012, and the light blue is our renewal scenario. And you have to see a sort of halving of emissions in that period. It's very similar to the IEA scenario. But one of the black elephants in the room, I think, is actually this is all about China. And I don't quite understand why here in the West we don't spend more time in the public debate focused on what we can do to work with China on that. I know a lot of you in Imperial are engaged with China, but that's, you can do all sorts of things to international oil companies, but you haven't addressed this. You haven't addressed much. This is the last, back to 1990. The pink is the GDP growth. The blue is the detachment of growth in energy consumption, and then the bottom black line is the vector for improvements in energy intensity. That's what's actually happened since the UN framework. A good start, but not nearly enough. So just dwell very quickly on a couple of numbers. So the energy intensity issue, if you model a 2-degree scenario for energy for CO2 levels at a sustained 2 degrees, and you move two big parts of that, the energy intensity of the whole GDP output and the contribution of renewables to actual supply, not to capacity, but to actual supply. Get to the bottom of my graph here, and the bottom left. To 2040, we'll have to have a track on energy intensity of the whole global economy that's 4 times the intensity that we have achieved since Kyoto. That's a big job, and it requires engagement and solution and focus on the whole economic system, not just 10% of the oil and gas part of that system, oil and gas production part of that system. And if you look at the bottom right, even if renewables since Kyoto has gone up 300%, but it's about 1% of primary energy supply on a global basis. Even if that goes up 11 times and energy intensity in the system has improved, there's still an enormous contribution from hydrocarbons, particularly oil and gas. And it seems to us that it's obvious that the best policy shift in that period is one between gas and coal consumption for reasons that many of you will be aware of. When we talk about renewables in power generation, a lot of the factoids I read about concentrate on investments which are almost at the level of fossil fuel investments, and even installed capacity, which is coming along. But actually, because of the black elephant of intermittency and network capacity, you can put all the renewables investment and capacity in that you like, but until we've solved the storage issue, the network capacity issue, we haven't solved much. And that's why I think Sir David King's and Lord Gus O'Donnell's initiative, called the Apollo Initiative, to actually get R&D focused into this as much as into renewables is going to be one of the keys to solving this issue. We're talking to them about whether we can have some contribution to that. Right, a very quick run through what our actions have been to date. And I think there are sort of 3 categories. The first is, what do we directly control as a wholesale producer of oil and gas? The second is, where can we have an indirect influence, which is more in an area that we're not so involved with, which involves consumption of oil and gas? And lastly, where can we collaborate with other elements of society to address this issue? So, in Norway, our CO2 footprint per barrel of oil equivalent produced is about 9 kilograms. The international average is twice that. So we've spent 20 years really addressing this issue within the area that's under most control, and we haven't stopped addressing it. We intend to continue to address that, and I'll show you how in a minute. And our own footprint for methane emissions from a Norwegian base is a fifth of that of the energy industry, of the oil and gas industry globally. So we've really been on this for quite a while. When you ask what on earth have you done, this is what we've done in the area of maximum control so far. And we've been a pioneer of carbon storage in the aquifers, but not at the post-combustion phase, but at the pre-combustion phase. So we've got a lot of experience of that. It's been going on a couple of decades, and the reason for it is carbon tax, as well as social and corporate philosophy. What we've been up to in the last couple of years, and at the moment, the way you're able to move the footprint on the production stream like that is by integrating savings and debottlenecking and improvements in efficiency in all the different pieces of machinery that sit out there in the North Sea, and by engaging the workforce and the managers in that. So last year we had about 250 projects which were initiated to improve in those areas. And we started projects that will save about 250,000 tonnes in 2014. And our current estimates for 2015 from that programme is about 330,000 tonnes. We also chose to join the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, which means that we've undertaken to publish our forecast roadmap plans for reducing methane. We are an operator internationally in North Dakota and in a field in a oil formation called the Bakken, where there's high flaring. When we first got into that business, we bought our way into that business and bought a company over there. The flaring level was about 30%, and this year we've reduced it to 20%. And looking forward, our ambition is to be the most carbon efficient oil and gas producer. That's driven in throughout the company. It's quite a big ambition. This is where we've got to. We have internal pricing of carbon. We have intensity targets for different types of hydrocarbon. The key performance indicators that affect the remuneration of people like me include carbon targets. We have our own flaring. We intend to halve our flaring intensity by 2020. What we're doing in the Bakken on fugitive methane, we have our own generated targets before North Dakota put in its own versions of that to reduce this significantly by 2020. And we have equivalent oil industry corporations across the Norwegian shelf, which I've listed there. So these are the sort of things that we're doing in our area of control. In the area of consumption, I said we created this new energy solutions business. That's essentially to start to invest in renewables. I'm running short of time here, but we've already invested several $1 billion into offshore wind farms in this country. We're about to invest several billion more in an adjacent wind farm. And we are one of the major investors in the Dogger Bank wind farm. And I was telling the British government about a week ago that actually, if they had a lower level of subsidisation for Dogger than they've given to Hinkley Point, they'd have a more reliable technology and quicker with a better carbon footprint and less residual fuel dilemmas to address. We are also pioneering what we call floating offshore, which will allow us to put windmills in the deeper areas and reduce the costs so that they're less. And we'll probably be building one of these large-scale pilots in Scotland shortly. I talked about our pre-combustion CCS, but we're also investing in a variety of pilots in post-combustion. And we stand ready to join the British government and Shell in Peterhead if that's something they all want to do. So I'll just come in for closing for about 3 minutes, Martin. So then in the area of collaboration and advocacy, we're members of lots of industry groups and sustainability groups. We take it and very involved with the UN. We take these engagements very seriously. But the thing we learned from TSB 25 is that actually we need to broaden that engagement. and get into debate with society generally, including with critics. Now, I'll end now by just speculating on what do I think a modern oil and gas company is going to have to do to step up over the next half decade and decade. This is not an announcement of new Statoil strategy. This is the speculations of a person in my position as to the sort of things that we might expect to have to do. So firstly, on time horizons, I've shown you lots of targets. They're mostly 2020 targets. But actually, I think we're going to have to explain to society what our contribution is to 2030 and 2050 in a much more understandable and detailed way than we have in the past. I think because of the lock-in that will come if we don't address this issue in the 2030s, 2040s, and because of the potency of methane, we're going to have to be much more forward-leaning on methane. It's not just about CO2. I think that getting leadership in society, particularly in companies like mine, to make them what I call future fit and fluent, we're going to have a lot more programs like that. It's not a one-off thing. We need to have that as a rolling part of our commercial education in multinationals. And we're going to have to put a lot more capital and scale into the renewables and CCS area. I think some of the challenge we'll face is as we move out from Norway, a high carbon tax area, and a society that is very dedicated to this issue, into other societies where we operate, we're going to have to think carefully about how we conduct ourselves there. It's a very different place to Norway. And I think also the Norwegian shelf, as it matures, and you get to a sort of threshold of operating costs and CO2 footprint from operations, but the productive capacity goes down. We need to think how we bend the curve there as the oil fields mature. And I think I'm responsible for portfolio management in Statoil. I think we're going to have much sharper and more transparent policy around how we manage the portfolio, not only for technical, commercial risk, financial risk, but also for climate risk. And finally, we're engaged with a lot of collaboration within the industry, a lot of lobbying of government, but we have to get much more engaged with society. That's one of the reasons I spent so much time with people like Joe Stiglitz and Jürgen Randers, but also people like Craig Bennett from Friends of the Earth here and Nina Jensen from World Wildlife Fund in Norway. You learn most from your fiercest critics, and I hope there are some in the audience. I look forward to the debate. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, John. What we're going to do is take time for some questions. And John, if you sit down here with also Margaret and Charlotte, that will be very good. And we'll take questions together. Now, I've got 2 microphones and they're being handed out. 1 on each side. You need to split yourselves. That's it. 1 over there. 1 over there. We're good. And I'm going to take a question from each of these sides. So we're going to do 1 and then another 1. So I'll start over here. And I've got a question in the middle. There we are. Yep. And when you ask questions, these questions need to be, haven't got much time, so please, we need succinct questions, not statements. Succinct questions, please. And please say who you are, where you come from.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, we're good.
Thank you very much. My name is Hussam, doing a PhD in the Petroleum Engineering Department at Imperial. The question really about the carbon tax. How much do you think Statoil's direction has been pushed by that? And would you have made any changes if the tax wasn't there?
Well, I think the pressure in Norwegian society on these kinds of issues is very forward-leaning. And so it's not just the tax, it's also the expectations of the society. I rabbited on a bit, so I didn't get time to say everything I wanted to say. This is a picture from yesterday. It's the Norwegian Prime Minister on the left, Erna Solberg, and a collection of Norwegian businessmen, some of them friends of mine. And this is business. This is Norwegian business putting to the Prime Minister the sort of policies they think are needed in the Norwegian transport sector, which are quite forward-leaning. So it's not just a question of legislation, it's also a question of attitude. There's no doubt that the carbon tax has motivated everybody who operates on the shelf, not just us, to address the carbon issue. I think it's a key economic incentives that really matter, which is why we call for appropriate carbon taxes. But I don't think it's the whole story.
So do you think that? Sorry,
Yeah, go on.
do you think that is what's missing with most kind of debate around?
Well, the people who follow us closely know that we are a strong advocate calling for global carbon taxes.
Thank you. A question over here. Yeah. Lady just in front of us. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Alice. I'm an engineer and I've been working in the oil and gas industry for 15 years. And my question on you is, well, I've worked in many Statoil projects actually as a contractor because I've worked always in oil services, so EPC services. And 1.5 years ago, actually, I was in Angola talking with Statoil team about the Kwanza field development. So one and a half year ago, Statoil was very much focused on ultra-deep water developments. But since then, oil price collapsed, fiscal and taxes are more stringent, and the policies are more are tougher on the industry. So therefore, you are changing to renewables. I mean, I'm not saying that's the reason you're changing, but you are finding a new way, a new business for Statoil. So my question is, who's going to pay for that? Because the dependency on oil is still massive, and the technology is not yet there to fully transfer to renewables, even though I
Thank you.
agree.
Okay, so carbon pricing and climate policy and regulation is a very important part of our business environment. But it's not always the sole or critical issue. So in the case of Angola that you speak of, actually we were looking for formations that are called, for pre-salt formations, similar to Brazil. We spent $1 billion on that in various ways, and the hydrocarbons aren't there. It's not that the hydrocarbons are there and they're too expensive. They're simply not there in any scale. And the reason for our creation of our new energy solutions business is much broader based than situation in Angola exploration. The low oil prices are a great challenge to the industry, but the industry was challenged before we had low oil prices. The margins, when we had $110 oil for a 3 or 4 year period, the industry got very lazy, and the margins on capital return were deteriorating, not due to climate policy, but due to cultural inadequacy. And so that I don't recognise the climate driver in your formulation. But I may have understood the question.
We are going to have to move on, but we have a time to ask him afterwards. Be all right. A question down here.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to not answer your question. Perhaps I didn't understand it. My apologies.
I was wondering, as you were speaking, haven't we been here before? Perhaps we could refer to the experience of BP and its famous Beyond Petroleum efforts and the billions which they spent investing in a range of alternative and renewable technologies with ultimately not that much to show for it. So there's an alternative perspective within the oil and gas industry, and some people might say, isn't it better for an oil and gas company like Statoil to focus on what it's actually better at, to invest its capital in areas where it remains most competitive, and to leave some of the alternatives to the Teslas or Chinese companies producing solar panels who are better capable of that, especially given, as you've pointed out, your perspective is that oil and gas will still be needed for decades.
Thank you.
In business, timing is everything. And 2015 and prospect to 2030 is a very different place to 1990 or 1995. We're in as I said at the beginning, we think we're in a very different era to the last 20 years. The second point I'd make is we make a very decent return on our offshore wind business. It's not hypothetical. It's a business that we have. It's producing about 8% returns on capital, given that it has a quasi-government guarantee under some of the income. There's no exploration risk. The construction risk is rather simpler than drilling in pre-salt deep water. It's quite a good risk return. So it's not a question of theological belief. It's a question of business sense. This is not a communication strategy. This is a business strategy.
Well, we can actually ask that. Charlotte, so how would you see the future Statoil going under this question?
Well, I would say, that oil and gas companies such as Statoil have a very good capability and capacity to deal with complex issues. And I think what's particularly interesting about offshore wind is that, of course, we know how to tame the oceans for oil and gas. So wind, of course, is a very natural progression into that and sits right at the heart of our core competence.
Okay, thank you. I have a question right at the front.
Edward Davey, Prince of Wales' office in London. Thank you for a very thoughtful and, I thought, transparent talk. A question about Paris. What's the best possible outcome we could get at Paris, and what more could we do to get the energy companies across the ocean speaking together in one voice in a truly progressive fashion, like I believe you are?
I've got some views on that, but I'll ask Margaret to have a go at that, and I might supplement it.
I think we are actually, some of us, trying to speak with one voice, and we showed that on Friday. A group of 10 companies came together in the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative to call for an ambitious and stable framework out of Paris that was going to get us to 2 degrees. And I think that was a really significant step forward for all of those oil companies to, talk about the 2 degree target and as a very important goal to aim for. And I think we've seen enormous amount of collaboration in the run-up. Paris has kind of galvanised that, so I think that's been really positive. But another thing to say is that we can't wait for, and we haven't actually waited for that policy. We've been taking action regardless because of the strategic beliefs that we have. So Paris is important, but it's a moment, and we will continue to take action afterwards as well.
I think it's been quite a novel and so far productive methodology to get nations to compete ahead of the meeting rather than squabble at the meeting, and the test of the pudding will be in 2016 when we see whether a better job is done politically to move that into legislation rather than let it flap in the wind.
I just asked, following that up, about Norwegian INDCs. Was Statoil very much involved in the sort of the semblance of that of Norwegian INDCs at all? What was this exchange between?
Yeah, I'll just make a quick comment and I'll ask Charlotte to supplement it. I mean, yes, so my boss talks a lot to the Prime Minister and to all her works, and if you look at the structure of greenhouse gas emissions in Norway, first thing you have to remember is that the electricity sector is essentially hydropower, so it's a great start for the nation. And so, very roughly speaking, a third is a third offshore activity, of which we're about 70 or 80%. A third is the transport sector, and a third is onshore industry. So our area is quite a large part of it. So the Norwegian government formulation in that area is very critical to our operations. Do you want to supplement that, Charlotte?
Yes, so the Norwegian INDC is basically is part of the European Union INDC, and it's part of the European Union Emissions Trading Scheme. But for Norway, as John said, it will be maybe harder than for many other countries because already 40%, pardon us, more, 60-70% is already from hydropower. So of course we have to play our own part, being a third of the CO2 emissions in the country to reduce these emissions.
And of course, as I said in my quick rattle through the factoids of what we've done, we're already at half of the international levels of the CO2 emissions from the offshore production. So there's a lot to do from a country that's done a lot.
Going to be in Paris? Statoil going to be there?
Yes, certainly.
Yes, we will be there. And it's very important, I think, for us in Statoil to be there and show our support for our partners. You saw a lot of logos before. We're a very proactive partner on a lot of initiatives, that is to reduce CO2 emissions across the world, and also bringing some of this technological capability we have in Norway to other parts of the world where they also need it. So we want to be there to support our partners, but also I think Statoil is in a good position to show support for the negotiators. We've been subject to a carbon tax since 1991. Look at our emissions figures. They are half of the world average. It actually works. And we want to be there to support them, to show that a good progressive agreement is okay for industry, and we are in support of that.
Thank you.
Charlotte's in charge of designing our roadmap to Paris.
Paul Arwise from Carbon Emitting Technologies. You highlighted that China was a black elephant. You didn't talk very much about what Statoil in particular, and maybe the West in general, should think about doing regarding China. I'd be fascinated to hear the views of you and your colleagues.
I spent the weekend at Ditchley Park at a conference, which is Chatham House rules, but we're able to talk about themes that were discussed there without going into details of what people said. We had a lot of people, senior people from American Energy, who work for the Energy Secretary there. And the sort of theme of our debate was on this. The Americans are doing a lot to discuss with the Chinese, the shale gas technology, which has driven the CO2 reductions in China. That's one element, I think. We've done some work with the national oil companies there in that area, but we have a high-level political difficulty, which makes it difficult to deepen that, which I won't go into any further.
Thank you. We have a question just over there. Gentleman in the blue shirt. Blue shirt, right in the middle. Blue shirt. Oh, well, I'm going to ask two more questions, one from over here and one more from over here. So who wants to ask a question?
Thank you. Max Huisman, Carbon Management, student from Edinburgh. I was wondering the preference of Statoil in regard to carbon pricing schemes. Are these carbon taxes or market-based mechanisms like the EU ETS, and why?
Do you want to have a crack at that?
Yes. So we are for a price on carbon, polluter pays principle. But it really is for each jurisdiction to define its own setup. Ideally, in our ideal world, we would have a global system that would basically have a level playing field for everybody. Probably unlikely for all the countries in the world to agree on that. But we do believe there is great momentum right now for carbon pricing in countries and regions, and for this to be interlinked. But I think what we've seen so far, each region or country might have its own circumstances. Sometimes you have to have a minimum price to get it going. Sometimes you might need some kind of an incentive in the system. So it's hard to say. We can't give sort of a broad answer of if it's going to be if tax is better than a market mechanism. But a price on carbon is really what's required. And I think what's quite interesting, if you're interested in this topic, is the World Bank runs something called a Partnership for Market Readiness, where they train country delegations of how to set up carbon mechanisms or systems for their own jurisdictions. And this is a very interesting process, and we are also part of this. There's a business element to it where we help the civil servants to kind of talk about unintended consequences and so on. So I think there's a very interesting space, and more countries are involved in this.
Yeah, and in general, the quickest and most effective thing we can contribute in that is to take part in the coal gas shift. So pricing, which takes account of that, is obviously something that's we engage in when talking to regulators about that issue on a more detailed basis, country by country.
A final question over here.
I'm Nigel Brandon from Imperial College. You mentioned energy storage as a critical issue, and as someone who works in that area, I was delighted to see that. But you might reinterpret that and say that in the future we need a more flexible energy system, and as we bring more complex energy vectors together, managing and controlling those becomes more of an issue. That provides perhaps challenges and opportunities for different companies, because we're seeing the Googles of this world move into the energy space. We're seeing electricity providers providing transport fuels. So what's your view of the role of, say, a Statoil or a company in your position in terms of how you engage with and find opportunities in a future energy system in which the commercial arrangements are also going to be very different, as well as the technical and engineering arrangements?
Yeah, so natural gas in Europe used to be sold to a dozen aggregators on long-term contracts with oil index linked. That's what gas marketing consisted of 20 years ago. And over the last 20 years, what's happened is with basically EU competition law-driven deregulation, and also the unintended consequences of what I think is a very strange German policy, which has come close to bankrupting their electricity sector. What we found is that we've gone from 12 large customers to hundreds and hundreds of customers of all shapes and sizes, with all sorts of different demands and profiles and creditworthiness. And so now about half of our gas is sold on long-term contracts, but to a lot of different people, and about half is sold in spot markets. That's actually a massive change of business model. It's one we've been able to master. Our largest competitor, Gazprom, has been a bit slower in adjusting, including on the pricing area. So we very much recognise that we may now be moving into an electricity generation model in society which is much more disaggregated, and we managed the last shift, and we're planning how to manage the next. When it comes to looking at renewables beyond wind, when we look at solar, what we see is that's most likely to have high growth in emerging markets where they'll miss out altogether centralised generation, and that's an area that we're sort of actively considering at the moment. Don't take that, journalists in the room, as a statement of new Statoil strategy. It's a speculation of an interested citizen.
Thank you. And any final thoughts from the two members of the panel?
No, just to add that one of the work streams or areas in our new energy solutions business area that's just been formed is new business models, and a group looking specifically into that, along with the other technology solutions that they're looking at.
And I would say that, as we heard from John, there's great challenges for this industry right now. Oil and gas will be there for a long time, but we have to decarbonize, and we have whole renewables that we have to come into the market at a good economic value. This is a fantastic space to be in right now, and it's very encouraging to see a lot of students interested in this topic, because we need all of your grey matter involved in this. And as an officer of Statoil, I'm very proud to be part of this industry right now.
Well, thank you very much, and please everyone join me for thanking Charlotte and Margaret and our speaker John. Thank you very much. know there are lots more questions, and so we do have an opportunity for you to ask a few more and to give you some details of how to ask John another question and maybe have a drink. And to say a few final words is my colleague, the other co-director of the Grantham Institute, Professor Joe Haigh.
I'm not just here to tell you about the drinks. I'm formally here to thank John and the Statoil team for coming and giving us this very interesting presentation. It's really encouraging to see how an oil and gas company can be actually embracing the idea of transition and looking forward into a new world where something's got to happen. And indeed, all of us need to accept that we're in that position. And we've heard about the Paris conference and how there's going to be INDCs, and we have to all appreciate that that's not the end of the story. Even if they're all agreed, we hope, and all the countries act on them, we've still got to do more to reduce carbon. And so it's very encouraging to hear that the big companies are on message in this sense. So that's enough of the proselytising. The Grantham Institute is presenting this talk. We have a number of other activities on at the moment, and please have a look at our website, and please join our mailing list if you want to hear about more of them. And indeed, I think there's some of our Outlook magazines available outside to pick up. But now for Martin, the important bit is that the drinks are on the lower ground floor. But thank you very much.